Thank you, Joy, and thank you to the Family Survival Trust for hosting me and for the opportunity, and thank you to everyone who's here now. And I would also like to say thank you to all the brave souls who have contributed to my podcast. It's not an easy thing for them to do. And in particular, some of them were gracious enough to share some photos of their childhoods that you're going to see today during this speech. Broadly speaking, what I'd like to cover today covers sort of three categories. Number one is sort of a general view of what the arc of a kid growing up in the Moonies could have been like. Number two, I'm going to look at some common themes that I've seen on my show, sort of the meta themes that I've seen developing as a result of speaking to a lot of people who grew up in this abusive environment. And number three, I'm gonna give a suggestion about how we as a society might consider dealing with the abuses of the Unification Church and other cults that operate in similar ways. And it's a way that I don't think has really been attempted before. So would love to hear some feedback on that during the Q&A part. Before I get into those three topics, I just want to start off by level setting on exactly what the Unification Church is, because it's not necessarily apparent from the outside. You might have heard of this guy. This is Sun Myung Moon. He's the guy who started the Unification Church. He was born in 1920 in what is now North Korea. At the age of 16, he claims he had a revelation from God or Jesus or some combination of them, maybe a few other points, doesn't really matter. And whoever these spiritual people were, they told him that it was his job to complete the unfulfilled mission of Jesus, thus making him the second coming, and to achieve the providence that God was working through him to achieve on this earth. He had to do a couple things. Number one is he had to get the whole world to basically bow down to him as its one true and supreme leader. And number two, in theory, everyone was supposed to graft onto his blood lineage, whatever the hell that means, to create a new original blood lineage on Earth. Now, Moon died in 2012. And since then, the remains of his empire have been squabbled over by various factions within his family, and it's splintered effectively into multiple subcults. So this is his wife, widow, Hak Jahan. She now runs the mainline group in the Moonies. This is one of his sons, Preston Moon. He, through a series of nefarious business dealings, effectively stole all the assets from his mother. This is Tatiana Moon. She was the heir apparent at one point, but she lost that position when it became known that she had an illegitimate child, which is a big no-no in the Unification Church. It has been speculated that it was her own mother who released a birth certificate. However, I don't have proof on that point. We also have this guy, Sean Moon. He now runs the infamous gun cult in the US. He has also gone on record calling for the beheading of his own mother. He was the heir apparent at one point as well. And when he lost that position, he decided to give himself a new crown full of bullets. This is just like a single page in the whole story. To be honest, I don't think it's inaccurate to compare this to Game of Thrones. These people, in my view, are caricatures of villains in films and TV shows. These are evil people running an evil empire. And I can't prove this, but part of me thinks that maybe the insane melodrama of all of this is an intentional distraction, because what's really going on here goes far beyond this family. Because the Moonies, what's really going on is the Moonies is a vast constellation of front groups. There are hundreds, if not thousands of them, and I'm going to name just a few right now. the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, the Universal Peace Federation, the Family Peace Association, Service for Peace, Generation Peace Academy. Do you see a trend here? ICUS, International Conference for the Unity of Sciences, excuse me, that's what that is. IMAP, International Media Association for Peace. True World Foods, this is the largest distributor of sushi in both the US and Europe. If you eat sushi in either of those geographies, there's a 90% chance that it comes through a Moonie run business. Car Arms, this is a gun manufacturer in the US. And then we have the jewel in the crown, the Washington Times. This is the media arm of the Moonie empire. And this newspaper, since inception in the 80s, so for 4 decades now, has intentionally aligned itself with the right wing in the US. And it has been a font of misinformation and disinformation for decades, serving to further polarize the dialogue and shift it further to the right in the US. This is an organization that has printed the so-called birtherism fallacy that was a prelude to Donald Trump's rise in the US. They also printed the fallacy on January 7th that it was members of Antifa that started the insurrection on January 6th. And that headline was then quoted by Senator Matt Gaetz in the US on the Senate chamber floor on January 7th. This is the influence that this organization has. They print lies and they become talking points that then become gospel more or less in the right wing. So it has had devastating consequences on democracy globally. And I cannot express this enough. This is only a drop in the bucket of the front groups that are out there. I found a list from 1980 and it had 1,400 front groups listed on it. I can only show like 60 on this page, and I know I'm breaking every rule in terms of graphic design with this slide, but the sheer enormity of this is incredible. And the enormity of it all, the complexity of it all, this entire evil empire did not come for free. It came at great cost. And the people who bore that cost were our parents, who were coerced into working for one of these front groups for their entire lives at below market rates, maybe sometimes no money, and always working to the bone. They bore that cost, but the cost was borne doubly by us kids who grew up in that environment. This is a photo of one of us at 8 days old. We all went through this ceremony at 8 days old. This is not me in this photo. But at 8 days, our lives were pledged to Moon and to his family. The servitude began, the slavery began at this age when everything about our lives was pledged to them. And incidentally, this is when our parents more or less abdicated all of the traditional child rearing responsibilities and decisions to the Moon organization. We were literally told to call Moon and his family our true parents, as if our parents were not our real parents. And incidentally, whilst that isn't me in the photo, my family had those literally exactly those photos in our houses, in our house. And this indoctrination started, it started from birth, and it happened day in, day out for the rest of our lives. So similar scenes would unfold every birthday, every Sunday. We would be bowing to these people and pledging our lives to them. Every day we would be reading the words of these psychopaths. And it was an all-encompassing indoctrination from day one. Now, some of our parents were working so hard for this criminal, evil empire that they were encouraged, coerced by the organization to give their kids up and place them in live-in group childcare facilities, effectively orphanage, so that the parents could go out and work harder for the organization. This is a tape that was recorded at one of these at one of these facilities in New York in the early 80s. The kids who were in this facility were living there full time, and their parents were out there doing, broadly speaking, one of three things: either raising money for the Moon org, recruiting people into the Moon org, or getting involved in some of the other political or influence rackets that the org was involved in, doing all of that full time, so much so that they had to leave their kids in these orphanages. The voice you're about to hear is that of a girl who's about 4 years old. I'm going to play the clip now.
What did you do at
You hear that?
I went to see my baby.
How is your baby? Can she walk?
She could walk when I'm holding both hands.
So the 4-year-old girl that you're hearing there, who's talking about going to see her baby, she's talking about her own younger sister, a girl who's about 1 year old. These kids had barely any conception of what parents were because they just weren't around. They had a rotating cast of childminders that would come in and out, but they just didn't have parents, to the point that this kid thought that she was the mother of her own younger sister. I'm going to play you another clip from this tape now.
Thank you, Mommy, for taking me for a little while with you. Please, thank you for this nice day and two pence. Alright.
Okay.
Let's hear it.
Now starting again.
Now I want you to come, Mommy, for a long time, and I don't want you to leave and bring me home for a long, long time. And I like it so much, so I really like it. So you must come for a long time, and we want you to come a long time. So please come in two parents' name only.
The kids in these facilities would see their parents a handful of times per year, maybe. And that phrase that the girl uses at the end, in true parents' name, that we were told that if we prayed in true parents' name, that would be the best way to communicate our most fervent desires. So all she wanted to do was see her mother, but she couldn't because she was out there raising money and influence for this evil empire. As I mentioned, that facility was based in New York State. And as a result of doing this show, I've become aware of many other facilities and other locations. I'm sure there are more, but these are just the ones that I know about. And some of them spanned those early years, but they also, in principle, could have covered a kid from birth up to the age of 18 and even into university. It would have been possible for a kid to just never even see their parents living in these places. Here's where some of the other ones are: Denver, Colorado, the Bay Area, Pasadena, California, Texas, England, the Netherlands, Korea. I spent a year there myself at the age of 13, and one in Connecticut. And I'm sure there are more. And even for us kids that were lucky enough to live with our parents, when we got a bit older, we still went through an insane amount of indoctrination on the weekends, during school breaks. So every summer camp, every winter break, every spring break, we would go to these workshops. And here you see a photo from one of these workshops. I'm not in this photo, but I'd guess these kids are about 12 years old. You'll see that there's no one there, no parent, no grown-up is there. My guess is that the kids are 12 and the people who are running the workshop are probably 14. And this was just part of the indoctrination. I attended countless camps like this, just getting the church theology drummed into me, week in, week out, year in, year out. And now I don't know for certain since I wasn't there, but if I had to guess, I would say that the sign that this kid is holding up that says Messiah Massacre, my guess is that that's a reference to the Moonies. One of the core tenets of the Moonie ideology, which is that the the Jewish people deserved the Holocaust as a result of being responsible for crucifying Jesus, in their view. That's the kind of terrible stuff that we were taught as kids. All of us were taught that at one point or another. And the Moonies don't talk about it that much now, but that is 100% part of their belief system. It's awful. When we got a bit older, some of us were sent to boarding schools abroad. This is one in Korea. I was there. I'm not in this photo, but I was in this room in this building myself. There are about 100 kids that lived here. It was a boarding school where we would effectively drop out of normal school and learn about church theology, the Korean language and Korean culture, since those are the, in theory, heavenly languages and cultures. And that's it. Our educations were completely abandoned effectively at that point. And there was very little adult supervision. There were about 100 kids living in this dorm and 4 dorm parents. So the things that happened, there were injuries that went untreated. There's a kid a year before me who fell off a building, a 4-story building, and broke his back. This is what happens when you have a ton of kids running around and no adults taking responsibility for them. When we got a little older, we were then forced into the political activism game for Moon. We became political foot soldiers for him. Here you see a young girl, I think she's 14 in this photo, proselytizing on the streets of the US. Clearly that's not me in that photo, but I have stood myself on trash cans just like that all over the US. And what she's doing and what I did was going out and trying to promote one of Moon's front organizations. In this case, it's something called the Pure Love Alliance. This was a group that was active mostly in the late 90s, and it intentionally sought to align itself with the burgeoning so-called purity movement in the US, which is aligned with certain aspects of the Christian community in the US, abstinence before marriage, fidelity within marriage. That was their thing. It aligned with Moon's theology, but more importantly, by ingratiating himself to those people on the right wing, he could gather more political influence. And we were the foot soldiers that helped him gain that influence by going out and doing those rallies and standing on these street corners. And I have to say here that we were told when we were doing these activities, if anyone ever asked if there's any religious affiliation, we were specifically told, don't say anything about the Moonies, tell them it's completely non-denominational and there's no religious affiliation here. This is it. Every kid on that tour was from the Moonies, for the record. And this is part of the Moonies' doctrine of so-called heavenly deception. The idea that it's okay to lie to people as long as it's for the sake of the organization. And that is something that was drummed into us from a very, very, very young age and was forced upon us in circumstances like this. When we weren't being drafted into Moon's political army, we were drafted into the financial army. This is the end game, in my view, of the coercion and manipulation and forced servitude that we were forced to endure from an early age. In this photo, you'll see what a so-called special task force van. In this one, there are 6 girls. They're all 16 or 17 years old. And there's a driver, a man who's 25 to 35 years old. That should raise alarm bells in any context, to be quite honest, but it never raised any alarm bells anywhere. And the Moonies have tens, if not hundreds, of these vans crisscrossing the US. And what these people are doing is they are going door to door fundraising walking through apartment buildings, going to bars, knocking on doors, both residential and commercial, trying to sell trinkets effectively. That is their full-time job. They do it probably 12 plus hours a day, 6, sometimes 7 days a week. They sleep in this van. They eat fast food pretty much every meal. Sometimes they sleep in parking lots. And the reason I say this is the end game to the coercion of the cult is because we were taught from a young age in all of those indoctrination programs that the pathway to heaven was paved by the number of dollars that we put in Moon's bank account. That's a core part of the doctrine, and we were taught that from birth, effectively. And to give you a sense of the scale of what's happening here, we did some back of the envelope math on my show. We estimated that an average performer on one of these vans would make about $60,000 per year. So in this van, they'd be making $300,000 per year, completely untaxed, untraceable. And there are many of these vans, tens if not hundreds, going around the country, certainly in 2002. And we'll come back to what's happening now in a few moments. In fact, we'll come to that now. Hold on one sec. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Okay. So that group that was doing that in 2002 was called Special Task Force. The Moonies have an age-old story. When one thing gets a little stale, when one front group gets a little stale, just kill it and come up with a new one with a different name. So that photo that you saw was from 2002. I'm going to show you a website, a live website today from Generation Peace Academy. This is the rebranding of the so-called Special Task Force. I'm going to pull this up here and you will see live right now today. These first-year participants, there's about 50 kids listed here, and there are multiple years. They have 3 years of program, by the way. All of these kids are out there today in 2022. They're out there right now doing that fundraising and putting that money into this evil empire's pockets. And they have suffered that lifetime of coercion from the very beginning of their lives, which has put them in a position right now where they are doing this activities. And this is a dangerous, dangerous activity. These people are not looked after. If you listen to my show, you will hear people get injured and the org doesn't care. They get sick, the org doesn't care. Sometimes they get sick and if they go to the hospital, they have to pay the bill themselves instead of the organization. This is happening here in Europe as well. And incidentally, the Moon org was intentionally sending kids out to do this work in the middle of the COVID pandemic. They took a breather for a couple of weeks, but then effectively convinced all the kids to feel that they would be more worthy of spiritual merit if they could find it in themselves to go out and fundraise, even in the midst of the COVID pandemic. That's how deep the coercion runs in this evil empire. And when I say that there are dangerous consequences, there are deadly consequences to this sort of work. In 2002, we talk about this on my show. In 2002, a young woman, could have been any of those girls in that photo you just saw, was out on one of these fundraising runs and went into an apartment building in North Carolina, and she was raped and murdered. And the murderer has gone to jail, but the Moon organization has not been held accountable for this at all. And they keep sending kids out in danger still to this day. I'm going to switch gears here for a second and talk about some of the common themes that I've seen developing on my show. Suicide and suicidal ideations. Unfortunately, this is a common theme on my show when I talk to people who have grown up in these circumstances. Direct sexual abuse and trauma. For kids who grew up in these more or less group homes with a rotating cast of caregivers coming in and out, those caregivers weren't vetted. The only qualification they had was having some passing allegiance to Moon. And sometimes all they wanted was a place to stay and a free meal. These adults were just let loose to run with these kids. Some awful things happened. And the org knows they've happened. And there's been no accountability for these at all. This is something that I've more recently become aware of. Indirect sexual abuse and trauma. I'm sure a psychologist will have a better term for this, but what I mean by this is the Unification Church has this core doctrine that all of us were brainwashed with from birth, that your body doesn't belong to you. Your body belongs to the spouse that Reverend Moon chooses for you. So we're taught that we don't have any agency in our own lives and in our own intimacy. And as a result, unfortunately, I have heard multiple accounts of women who have been in situations with men where they simply didn't feel that they could say no. They didn't know it was an option because they were coached from birth not to think that they could. And so unfortunately, I've heard it multiple times of women being raped as a result of this upbringing. And yes, I hold this evil empire that is called the Unification Church accountable for that. Sickness, injury, and death due to abandonment and neglect. We've covered some of that already. Fraught relationships with families. As you can probably imagine, it's quite difficult to have good relationships with families who are not willing to face the reality of what they've done to their kids. Many of our parents, if they're not still in the Moonies, they've joined another cult. It's a very difficult situation for most of us with our families. Educational neglect is a huge theme that comes up. I only missed a year of schooling when I was in Korea at the age of 13, but some kids missed a lot more than that, and it has had devastating consequences on their lives. PTSD and CPTSD, also themes that have come up for kids who've grown up in these circumstances. And there are many more. These are just some that come to mind. And I also want to make it really clear that everything we've talked about is a drop in the bucket of the list of rackets and abuses that the Unification Church is responsible for. I'm going to list a few here, but just know that for everyone here, there's about 100 more. Institutionalized beatings to treat illnesses. These so-called illnesses included homosexuality. They included mental illnesses. We were beaten to treat these things. The pay to liberate ancestors scam, marriage trafficking, child marriage trafficking, the child sex subcult and cover up. This happened in the Washington, D.C. area. It's a lot of information is coming to light right now. These people should absolutely go to jail for that. And it was covered up from the bottom to the top of the organization. Religious visa fraud, asylum visa fraud, death squad funding. Yes, the Moonies have funded death squads in various countries around the world. They have been tied to the Yakuza. They have supported multiple fascist regimes. Mass blood harvesting. This is something that happened to me. Cash trafficking. I'm sure this happened at a grand scale in many places, but for me personally, there was one time when I was personally enlisted to travel to transport $10,000 in my shoes between two war-torn African countries. That actually happened, and it was a dangerous thing to do in hindsight. Probable cover-ups of child deaths. I am very, very, very sure that this has happened. I don't quite have the proof yet, but when a smoking gun makes itself known, I will be sure to talk about it on my show. plus countless more. And so when I think about all this, and this kind of goes to Tom's point earlier in the introduction, why are we so bad as a society at dealing with this stuff, both here in the U.S. as well as in the UK, in the UK as well as in the U.S. where I'm from. Sorry about that. We just seem to be awful at dealing with anything like this, and it seems to me like anyone who waves the word religion around just kind of gets a free pass. Literally, they can get away with murder. And so as I've been thinking about this and having some conversations with guests on my show, personally, I think we should be looking at this through a different lens. I think the Unification Church is a human trafficking organization, and I'm going to prove it to you now using the definition from the United Nations. For human trafficking to take place, you need one element from each of these columns: an act, a means, and a purpose. And if you have one element from all three columns, then the perpetrator is guilty of human trafficking. So let's go through this. Column one, the acts: recruiting. Yes, they recruited our parents. Transport. Yes, you saw the van. Transfer. Yes, moving people around. Harboring. Yes, keeping people in various houses around the country and around the world. Receiving. Yes, allowing those people into those places. So congratulations, Moonies. 5 out of 5 acts of human trafficking you are guilty of. Now we need to look at the means. Coercion. We were coerced from birth to believe that a life of servitude was the only thing that mattered, that our only purpose in life was to serve Moon and his family. Fraud. This is an organization that's been investigated for fraud on multiple fronts in multiple countries over the years. Deception. These guys admitted to it themselves. They came up with the idea of heavenly deception. The abuse of a position of vulnerability. Now, I haven't done the work on this myself, but many people who study cults have made the point that cults, almost by definition, prey upon people. They recruit people when they are at a vulnerable point in their lives. And finally, a purpose for exploitation. I don't know how you can look at everything I've just talked about and not think that we were exploited and that our parents were exploited. Our lives were exploited. I was told that the only purpose of my life was to serve this guy. I was meant to be a slave. Thankfully, I'm not, but that's what he wanted, and he's got it. Well, until he died. Now his family's got it, with people around the world being exploited. And it's happening at a far higher level than you might be aware of. This is Jose Manuel Barroso. He's the current chairman of Goldman Sachs. This is Dr. Sarah Gilbert. She's the creator of the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. And these are photos of both of them speaking at rallies hosted by Moonie front groups in 2022 and 2021, respectively. Almost all of these speakers are paid a speaking fee. And that speaking fee comes from those kids in those vans whose lives have been shattered, whose lives have been completely passed over to this organization. These people have profited from that. And it gets worse too, because not only have they accepted the money, but what's happening on the other side is the Moonies are saying to their members, hey, guess what? Look at these VIPs who are speaking at our events. This is evidence that God's providence is working. This is evidence that Reverend Moon is being accepted in the world. So not only are they profiting, but they're also serving to further perpetuate the cycle of abuse. And it doesn't stop here. There are so many more people who have accepted Moonie money for speaking at these events, and that includes none other than this guy. Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, Newt Gingrich, Mike Pence, the former VP of the US, all of these right-wing grifters have accepted money for speaking at these events, amongst many other right-wing grifters, quite honestly, and many other VIPs of various stripes. And I don't expect Trump and his gang of right-wing grifters to show any remorse or have any dignity or have any shame. It's very on brand for them to be happy taking exploited money. So I don't think there's any course of recourse to expect from Trump. But for Barroso and for Gilbert, they work for Goldman Sachs and they work for AstraZeneca. And guess what? Both of these companies have anti-human trafficking charters. And both of these companies have ethics hotlines that you can call and tell them if you have evidence of people profiting from human trafficking. So this video is going to be recorded and eventually it's going to be released to YouTube. And when that happens, I'm going to call those phone numbers at Goldman Sachs and at AstraZeneca. And I'm going to share with them everything that I've shared with you today. And I'm going to ask them for two things. Number one, I'm going to ask for Barroso and for Gilbert to give a video apology, something that can be shared with the Moonies, specifically to counteract the damage that they've done by lending credence to these events and letting the Moonies use their names and appearances to further that cycle of indoctrination and coercion. That's the first thing I'm going to ask them for. But secondly, Mr. Barroso and Dr. Gilbert, if you have a shred of dignity, you should give that money back. You should absolutely give that money back, but don't give it back to the Moonies. Give it to a charity. And if you can't think of one to give it to, then give it to this one, the Family Survival Trust, who's out there working with cult survivors. And if you don't give that money back, Mr. Barroso and Dr. Gilbert, if you don't give that money back, as long as you hold a single cent of that Moonie money, you have the blood of this girl on your hands. You have profited from her death.
I want you to come, Mommy, for a long time, and I don't want you to leave and bring me home for a long, long time. And I like it so much, so I really like it. So you must come for a long time, and we want you to come a long time. So please come.
Mr. Barroso and Dr. Gilbert, I want you to listen to the pleas of that girl. Listen to those pleas and those tears. And I want you to know that there are thousands of other kids who have suffered neglect, abuse, abandonment, and yes, even death at the hands of this evil empire. And you are the direct recipient of money that comes from that. And it's my hope that those tears and those pleas of those kids, I hope they haunt you every night of your life until you give that money back. Thank you.